close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You are standing in the heart of the ancient Roman Empire. The marble streets of Rome are alive with noise, the cries of merchants selling their goods, the clash of soldiers training in the barracks, the whispers of senators plotting in dark corners. Above it all, the empire stretches across 3 continents, ruling over 60 million people. And at its center, sitting on the throne of the most powerful state the world has ever known, is a man. He wears the crown of absolute authority, commands legions of warriors, and holds the fate of nations in his hands. But here is the twist. That man, Marcus Aurelius, did not spend his nights dreaming of conquest or luxury. Instead, in the dim light of a flickering oil lamp, he sat hunched over scraps of papyrus, writing to himself words that would outlast all the monuments, all the battles, and all the glory of Rome. Words not meant for the Senate, not meant for history, not even meant for us. He wrote them only for himself, private reminders, self-corrections, meditations. And yet, those words became one of the greatest treasures of human wisdom, meditations. Now pause with me here. What kind of ruler does that? What kind of emperor, in the middle of plagues, invasions, and endless political intrigue, takes the time to ask himself, am I being a good person? Am I living with integrity? Am I prepared for death? Doesn't that sound almost impossible? And yet, this is what Marcus Aurelius did. This is what makes him not just another name in the long list of kings and conquerors, but a figure who still speaks to us 2,000 years later, with the clarity of someone who understands what it means to be human. Because Marcus Aurelius was not just a Roman emperor. He was the philosopher king, the living proof of Plato's ancient dream that rulers should be philosophers and philosophers should rule. He was a man who lived at the intersection of unimaginable power and profound humility. And that tension, the clash between the demands of an empire and the demands of the soul, is what makes his story so compelling. And let me be honest with you, this is not just history. This is not some dusty biography from a forgotten past. This is a mirror that shows us what it means to face chaos, suffering, loss, and power, and to do it without losing your humanity. That is why I want you to stay with me through this entire journey. Because by the end of this video, you won't just understand who Marcus Aurelius was. You'll see why his wisdom might just save your life today. So before we dive deeper, do me a small favor. Hit that like button right now so this story can reach more people. Subscribe to the channel if you want to explore more of these timeless lessons. And if you find real value in this, consider leaving a super thanks. It's one of the best ways to support the channel, so we can keep creating content that digs beneath the surface. But most importantly, stay until the end, because Marcus Aurelius has something to teach you that no self-help book, no motivational speaker, no flashy TED Talk will ever deliver. He teaches you how to live and how to die with dignity. But let's rewind the story for a moment. Marcus Aurelius was born in 121 AD, a boy from a noble family, but not destined for absolute power. In fact, fate played its hand in unexpected ways. He was adopted into the imperial line, raised under the watchful eye of Emperor Antoninus Pius, groomed not with promises of luxury, but with the expectation of duty. From the very beginning, Marcus's life was shaped by philosophy. While other young nobles chased pleasure, ambition, and the thrill of games, Marcus was already obsessed with deeper questions. What is virtue? What is justice? How do I live in harmony with nature? He read Epictetus, the Stoic slave whose teachings would guide his soul for the rest of his life. He studied logic, rhetoric, and law, but always returned to philosophy as his anchor. Stoicism taught him that you cannot control the world, but you can control yourself. That death is inevitable, but disgrace is optional. That power is fleeting, but character endures. And this is what prepared him for the throne, even though no philosophy class in the world could ever truly prepare a man for what he would face. Because when Marcus finally became emperor in 161 AD, the world did not hand him peace. It handed him fire. A devastating plague swept across the empire, killing millions, including members of his own family. Invasions pressed on the borders. Corruption festère in Rome. Betrayals crept through the halls of power. And yet, in the middle of this storm, Marcus Aurelius turned again and again to the only thing that could not be taken from him: his own mind, his meditations, his philosophy, his reminder to himself that the measure of a man is not what he suffers, but how he suffers it. Think about that for a second. How often do we imagine emperors as untouchable, larger than life, almost gods? And yet here was the most powerful man alive, sitting in a freezing tent at the edge of the empire, writing to himself, "You may leave this life at any moment. Let that determine what you do, say, and think." And isn't that the same truth we need today? You don't have to be emperor to feel overwhelmed by life. You don't have to command legions to feel the weight of responsibility on your shoulders. Whether you're raising a family, leading a business, or simply trying to survive the chaos of daily life, Marcus's struggle is your struggle. His words are your words. His fight is your fight. That is why his voice matters. Because he teaches us that greatness is not about wealth or power, it's about how we carry ourselves when everything else is falling apart. Now here's what's really fascinating. Marcus never intended for anyone to read his writings. Meditations was not written as a book. It was a journal, a diary, notes from a man to himself, reminding himself not to lose sight of virtue, not to be consumed by anger, not to waste time on gossip or envy. And yet, these private whispers have become one of the most celebrated guides to life ever written. Why? Because they are raw. They are real. They're honest in a way that few works of philosophy ever are. They reveal not just a thinker, but a man flawed, struggling, human. And this is why Marcus Aurelius continues to inspire leaders, thinkers, and everyday people across centuries. From statesmen to soldiers, from CEOs to students, countless men and women have found strength in his words. Modern psychology, especially cognitive behavioral therapy, owes much to Stoic principles. The idea that our thoughts shape our reality, that we can reframe our struggles, that we can face pain with resilience, that is Marcus Aurelius speaking to us through time. So let me ask you, if Marcus Aurelius could carry the weight of the world on his shoulders and still remind himself every day to live with kindness, patience, and humility, what's stopping us? If he, surrounded by war, disease, and treachery, could still hold on to his humanity, what excuse do we have in our modern lives? That is why his story matters. And that is why you should stay until the very end of this video. Because Marcus Aurelius is not just a chapter in history. He is a challenge. He challenges you and me to rise above our excuses, our distractions, our fears. He challenges us to live not as slaves to circumstance, but as masters of our own character. So again, before we go deeper, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more explorations of timeless philosophy, and if you want to help keep this channel alive, hit that super thanks button below. But most of all, open your mind, because what Marcus Aurelius discovered in his darkest nights could very well change the way you face your own mornings. When we look back at the Roman Empire during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, what we often imagine is marble palaces, triumphal parades, and a ruler who commanded the known world with ease. But that is the polished image of Rome, the kind we see in movies or textbooks, not the lived reality. In truth, the throne of Marcus Aurelius was never a place of comfort. It was not a seat of pleasure, but a burden of suffering, a constant weight that tested the limits of his endurance. He ruled between 161 and 180 AD, and in those 19 years, he faced almost every possible calamity that could strike a state. Wars on multiple frontiers, a devastating plague that nearly crippled the empire, and endless plots and rivalries that threatened to undo the fragile balance of Roman politics. The so-called Golden Age of the Antonines, which historians sometimes celebrate, was golden only in hindsight. For Marcus, it was a battlefield, and not only against external enemies, but against despair, chaos, and the corruption of power itself. The empire he inherited was vast, perhaps too vast. From the icy frontiers of Britain to the deserts of Syria, Rome stretched over 3 continents, and while that expanse brought glory, it also brought vulnerability. The Germanic tribes pressed against the northern borders, testing Rome's strength year after year. To the east, the Parthian Empire remained a constant rival, ready to exploit any weakness. And inside the empire itself, there were tremors, unrest in the provinces, pressure from an overtaxed economy, and the constant churn of politics where loyalty could turn to betrayal overnight. For Marcus, every decision carried enormous stakes. Choosing which frontier to defend was not just a military calculation, it was a gamble with millions of lives. Sending legions east might mean leaving the north exposed. Spending coin to fund a campaign might mean neglecting the starving citizens in Italy. And all the while, the plague, the Antonine Plague, named after the family of Marcus, swept through the empire like an invisible army, killing soldiers, civilians, and even nobles without distinction. Modern scholars suspect it was smallpox, and it wiped out somewhere between 5 and 10 million people. Imagine being the emperor in that moment, watching your empire decay, not from swords and spears, but from disease. That was Marcus's reality. And yet, he bore it not as a tyrant, but as a philosopher who believed that life would always test us with what lies outside our control. He could not stop the plague, no matter how many physicians were summoned. He could not stop the barbarian tribes from probing Rome's defenses, no matter how many treaties were signed. He could not silence the whispers of betrayal in the Senate, no matter how many speeches he gave. What he could control was his own response. That is why the image of Marcus Aurelius as a man who saw his throne not as a reward but as a burden is so powerful. For him, the crown was a weight, not a prize. Marcus Aurelius lived this truth more intensely than almost anyone in history. He knew that to be emperor was not to be free, but to be chained to responsibility. In his meditations, he wrote not to glorify his victories, but to keep himself sane in the face of endless trials. The wars he fought were not optional campaigns of expansion. They were wars of survival. On the northern frontier, the Marcomannic Wars consumed much of his reign. Germanic tribes pushed into Roman territory, sometimes crossing the Danube in large numbers, threatening Italy itself. Marcus did not sit in Rome directing battles from afar. He lived with his soldiers in military camps, enduring the same cold, the same mud, the same shortages. The image of the emperor writing philosophy in a freezing tent while surrounded by soldiers is one of the most striking contrasts in history. The most powerful man in the world, stripped of comfort, scribbling reminders to himself about patience and humility. He did not see the throne as a place of indulgence, but as a front row seat to human suffering. And then there was the plague. Imagine the impact of COVID-19 in our own world, then multiply it in a society without modern medicine, where disease spread unchecked and fear dominated every household. To retreat into palaces and surround themselves with pleasures to numb the horror. But Marcus kept facing the reality head-on, knowing he could not escape it. In fact, some scholars believe that much of Meditations was written during these plague years, as if he was forcing himself to cling to philosophy when everything around him was collapsing. His words, "Do not act as if you're going to live 10,000 years. Death hangs over you," were not abstract musings. They were written in the shadow of mass graves. Political intrigue only deepened the strain. Roman politics was never free from ambition and betrayal, and even a philosopher emperor could not escape it. Senators resented his reforms. Generals eyed power for themselves. Court officials jockeyed for influence, sometimes sabotaging rivals in ways that destabilized the very empire they served. Marcus himself was not spared from painful betrayals. His co-emperor, Lucius Verus, who had been appointed to rule alongside him, proved more concerned with luxury than with duty. Others around him exploited the chaos of plague and war to enrich themselves. And yet, Marcus did not lash out in paranoia or bloodlust, as so many emperors before him had done. He tried, as best as any man could, to govern with patience and justice, though he must have known how fragile his position really was. What emerges from this context is not the image of a serene philosopher detached from reality, but a man crushed by reality and still refusing to surrender to despair. This is why the idea of the throne as a place of suffering rings so true. For Marcus, rulership was a constant balancing act, holding together a collapsing world while reminding himself not to lose his soul in the process. It is almost ironic that history calls his reign part of Rome's golden age, because for Marcus himself, it must have felt like anything but golden. It felt like endless fire, and yet in that fire, he forged words that still burn with clarity today. It is easy to admire emperors for their victories or their monuments. But what makes Marcus Aurelius unforgettable is that he gave us not just an empire, but an example. He showed us what it means to sit on the highest throne in the world and still see it as a place of trial, not triumph. He showed us that even in the face of plague, war, and betrayal, the true battle is always within the battle to remain just patient and human. That lesson is as relevant now as it was then, whether we are leaders of nations or simply leaders of our own families. The weight of responsibility can feel crushing. But Marcus teaches us that the crown, whatever form it takes, is never meant for comfort. It is meant for endurance, for service, and for the constant struggle to do what is right in a world that so often pushes us toward what is easy. Marcus Aurelius has often been called the Philosopher King, a man who somehow managed to balance the impossible, absolute authority over the largest empire on earth, and an unshakable dedication to philosophy as a way of life. To understand Marcus in his fullness, we have to picture the strange duality of his existence. By day, he was a ruler making decisions that affected millions of lives. He commanded legions, signed decrees, negotiated with enemies, and held the weight of the Roman world on his shoulders. By night, or in stolen moments during campaigns and journeys, he became a student again, not of politics or law, but of philosophy. This double life, emperor and philosopher, was not a luxury for him. It was survival. Philosophy was not something he did after his duties. It was the very thing that kept him grounded enough to carry them out. His entire reign can be understood as a long experiment in whether it is possible to live according to wisdom while holding unimaginable power. Meditations, the book that would later immortalize him, is proof of this. But it is important to remember that Marcus never intended it to be a book at all. He was not writing for an audience, not composing for posterity. He was writing to himself. They are notes, reminders, self-corrections. It is like peeking into a man's private journal where he admits his fears, scolds himself for weakness, and urges himself toward virtue. When he writes, waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. He is not lecturing us. He is chastising himself. Plato argued that the only way a society could be just was if its rulers were philosophers, and its philosophers rulers. To him, most leaders were consumed with greed, ambition, and ignorance. Only those who had trained their minds to love truth and justice could resist the corruptions of power. To most readers through history, this seemed utopian, even naive. Who could imagine a man powerful enough to command armies, also being humble enough to question himself every day? But then Marcus appeared, almost like a living answer to Plato's challenge. He was not perfect, certainly not, but he embodied the paradox. He was an emperor who spent more time in self-examination than self-celebration. He governed not with the arrogance of a conqueror, but with the sobriety of someone who knew that all glory fades and all men die. To grasp the depth of this, one can imagine him dealing with treacherous senators or incompetent generals during the day, and then at night writing to himself lines like, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." He did not dream of immortality through conquest, but through character. That is why his private words resonate more powerfully than most public speeches in history. They were written by a man who knew that the hardest battle is not fought against foreign armies, but against one's own weaknesses. In modern life, we can see how radical this is. Imagine a president of the United States keeping a diary where, instead of justifying policy, he chastises himself for being too proud or too easily irritated. Imagine a CEO of a global company spending his late nights not strategizing for profit, but writing reminders to himself to treat his employees with patience, to resist greed. It is also worth remembering that Marcus's reign was not without flaws or contradictions. He made mistakes, as every ruler does. He waged long wars that drained the empire. He made compromises in politics that perhaps betrayed Stoic ideals. He even appointed his son Commodus as heir, a decision that would later prove disastrous. But even these mistakes reveal something important, that a philosopher king is not a perfect king. He is still human. He is still bound by circumstances, pressures, and his own limitations. Philosophy does not eliminate error. It makes one aware of it. That awareness, that humility, is what sets Marcus apart. The beauty of Marcus Aurelius's life is in this tension. He was not a philosopher who escaped the world, nor a ruler who ignored wisdom. He lived at the crossroads of both, and his writings show the constant struggle to reconcile them. His meditations are filled with this conflict. On one page, he reminds himself of the futility of ambition. On the next, he acknowledges the duties of leadership. He was always torn between the Stoics' call to detach and the emperor's call to engage. That he did not collapse under this tension, but instead turned it into wisdom, is why his legacy endures. In the end, Marcus Aurelius's greatest gift is not the empire he preserved, but the inner empire he revealed, the empire of the mind, the soul, the character. He showed that even at the highest seat of worldly power, the most important kingdom is within. This is why he stands as a bridge between Plato's dream and our reality, between philosophy and politics, between human weakness and human greatness. He reminds us that power without philosophy is dangerous, but philosophy without responsibility is incomplete. A daily guide for dealing with the unpredictability and chaos that we all face. At its core, Stoicism insists on one simple but profound distinction. There are things within our control, and there are things beyond it. Everything in life can be divided into those two categories, and wisdom lies in focusing entirely on the first while accepting the second. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself of this distinction constantly. He wrote to himself that we do not control other people. We do not control death. We do not control fortune. We do not control the turns of politics or the blows of war, but we do control how we respond. We control our thoughts, our choices, our actions, our attitude. In his words, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. When you step back, this idea seems almost too simple, but its power is obvious when you apply it to real situations. Imagine you're stuck in traffic, late for an important meeting. Your stress levels rise, your anger builds, your mind begins to spiral. Most of us treat the traffic as an enemy, but it is not within our control. The only thing in our control is how we respond. Do we lose our temper? Do we panic? Do we arrive flustered? Or do we breathe, accept the delay, and focus on doing our best when we arrive? Marcus would remind himself that rage against the uncontrollable is wasted energy. The same is true when facing rejection, illness, or the sudden loss of opportunity. Life throws these things at us without warning, and while we cannot stop them, we can decide how we will carry them. For Marcus, philosophy was the art of carrying life's burdens with dignity. This principle is timeless, but it is perhaps even more urgent in modern life than it was in ancient Rome. Consider the pressures of work today. Many people live under constant deadlines, emails that never stop, expectations from bosses, competition with peers, and fear of being replaced. Anxiety and burnout are everywhere. But the Stoic distinction provides a kind of compass. You cannot control whether your boss has unrealistic demands, You cannot control whether your company restructures or whether the market crashes. You cannot control whether people gossip or criticize. What you can control is your effort, your integrity, your willingness to show up and give your best. You can control your decision to focus on quality rather than getting lost in panic. The Stoic approach is not passivity, it is clarity. It is choosing to invest energy where it can actually make a difference. Marcus himself lived this under harsher conditions than most of us could imagine. He faced invasions that threatened Rome's survival, plagues that killed millions, and political intrigues that could have ended his life. At any moment, he might have lost everything. And yet his writings show him constantly returning to the same theme. I cannot control what fortune brings, but I can control whether I face it with courage. That is a lesson anyone today who feels overwhelmed by personal crisis, divorce, financial struggle, illness, loss can relate to. The crisis may not be our choice, but our response always is. One of the hardest parts of Stoicism, though, is accepting what lies beyond control. Acceptance sounds simple, but is deeply challenging. Human beings cling to the illusion of control. We like to think if we just plan better, work harder, or worry longer, we can force the world to obey us. But Marcus would remind us again and again that control is limited. Death will come. Loved ones will suffer. Friends will betray. Circumstances will twist in ways we could not predict. The only sane way to live is to prepare for these inevitabilities and to accept them when they arrive without bitterness. He wrote, "Do not act as if you're going to live 10,000 years. Death hangs over you. While you live, while it is in your power, be good." This is not morbid, it is liberating. By accepting death, we free ourselves from the paralysis of fear. By accepting that others may wrong us, we free ourselves from the burden of resentment. By accepting what we cannot change, we make room to fully engage with what we can. If we bring this into the context of modern personal struggles, think about the epidemic of anxiety. So much of anxiety is rooted in focusing on what we cannot control. What if I lose my job? What if people think poorly of me? What if the economy collapses? What if I get sick? None of these are under complete control. Marcus's advice would be to redirect energy. Prepare reasonably, yes, but stop tormenting yourself with what-ifs. Live in the present moment. Do your duty now. Do not ruin your life imagining disasters that may or may not happen. This is powerful advice for anyone struggling with stress today, and modern therapy echoes it in practices like mindfulness and cognitive behavioral therapy. The same principle applies in leadership, which makes Marcus's life especially instructive for modern CEOs, politicians, and managers. Leadership always means carrying responsibility for what you cannot fully control. A CEO cannot control the economy, the actions of competitors, or the unexpected crisis that shatters markets. A politician cannot control global events, natural disasters, or even the moods of voters. And yet leaders are judged by how they respond to what they cannot command. Marcus's example is striking. Instead of chasing glory, he reminded himself that the role of a leader is service, that the empire's stability mattered more than his own comfort. His willingness to endure hardships alongside his soldiers showed that true leadership is about character, not just authority. Modern leaders could learn from this. Imagine a corporate executive who chose to cut their own pay during hard times before asking employees to sacrifice. Or a politician who admitted the limits of their control and focused instead on honesty and resilience. That would be Marcus's approach. There are modern examples that echo Stoic principles. During the 2008 financial crisis, many leaders panicked, cut corners, or tried to shift blame. But some CEOs, like Howard Schultz of Starbucks, openly confronted the reality of the downturn, cut their own salaries, and focused on building trust rather than pretending control. In politics, leaders like Nelson Mandela embodied Stoic resilience, surviving decades in prison without bitterness, and then guiding a nation toward reconciliation. In both cases, the lesson was clear. Focus on what can be controlled: personal character, daily actions. the treatment of others while accepting the turbulence of larger forces. Marcus would have recognized this as the essence of leadership. Another key Stoic lesson is the rejection of anger and resentment. Marcus repeatedly reminded himself not to be consumed by hatred. He lived in a world full of betrayal, yet he wrote, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." That is advice still relevant for people navigating workplace politics, family disputes, or public controversies. Anger feels powerful in the moment, but quickly corrodes the one who holds it. Resentment wastes energy that could be spent on growth. In today's climate of outrage, whether in politics, social media, or personal life, Marcus's calm voice reminds us that dignity lies in self-mastery, not retaliation. Consider how relevant this is to the world of social media. Every day, people are dragged into online arguments, obsessed with likes and comments, consumed by envy of others' highlight reels. Marcus would see this as a distraction from what matters. He would remind us that external opinions are outside our control. Whether strangers approve or criticize is irrelevant. What matters is whether we live according to our values. He wrote, "It never ceases to amaze me. We all love ourselves more than other people, but care more about their opinion than our own." In the age of Instagram and Twitter, this is as sharp as ever. The Stoic choice is to stop chasing validation and instead cultivate self-respect. The practicality of Stoicism is also seen in its emphasis on duty. Marcus believed each person has a role, and that role must be fulfilled regardless of difficulty. He compared life to actors in a play. You do not choose your role, but you can choose how well you play it. For him, being emperor was not an honor, but a responsibility, and he tried to perform it with justice. For us today, this might mean seeing our jobs, our roles as parents, spouses, or citizens, not as burdens, but as responsibilities to fulfill with dignity. A nurse in a hospital during a pandemic, a teacher guiding children through uncertain times, a single parent working 2 jobs, each embodies Stoic duty more than any words could. The value of life is not in avoiding hardship, but in fulfilling duty with integrity. Perhaps the most radical element of Stoicism is its insistence on living in harmony with nature. For Marcus, this meant recognizing that everything that happens is part of a larger order, that resisting reality only causes suffering. This does not mean passive acceptance of injustice or cruelty. It means accepting that the world is bigger than our will. Modern people might struggle with this, but we can see its wisdom in times of crisis. When a natural disaster strikes, we cannot control the storm. We can only respond with courage and compassion. When illness comes, we cannot control the fact of mortality, but we can control how we live in the face of it. Marcus's philosophy was not escapism. It was the ultimate confrontation with reality. In many ways, Stoicism anticipates the modern idea of resilience. Today we talk about resilience in business, in psychology, in education. We admire people who adapt to adversity, who endure without breaking. Marcus Aurelius lived resilience long before the word was popular. His entire philosophy was resilience. Endure what you cannot change, act wisely where you can, and never surrender your character. He modeled resilience not as an abstract concept, but as a daily practice, something to be worked on like exercise or training. That is why his words still inspire athletes, soldiers, entrepreneurs, and anyone who faces difficulty. If we strip Stoicism down to its essence, it is about freedom, the kind of freedom no emperor can grant and no tyrant can take away. The freedom to govern oneself. Marcus lived under the illusion of commanding the world, but he knew his true task was commanding himself. For the rest of us, that is liberating. You do not need to be emperor to practice Stoicism. You only need to recognize the boundaries of control and take responsibility for yourself. That shift in perspective can change the way we face everything from small daily frustrations to life's greatest tragedies. The philosophy of Marcus Aurelius reminds us that wisdom is not about escaping responsibility, but about bearing it well. It is not about eliminating suffering, but about transforming how we meet it. It is not about winning control over the world, but about winning control over the self. In a time where modern life pushes us to chase control, we do not have social approval, market stability, certainty about the future. Stoicism offers an anchor. It says, look inward, master yourself, and you will be stronger than any storm. Marcus Aurelius lived this truth at the highest level. But it applies equally to the rest of us, whether we lead nations, businesses, or simply our own lives. When Marcus Aurelius sat down to write in his private journal during the Antonine Plague, he was not only an emperor, but a man surrounded by death and uncertainty. The Antonine Plague, which historians believe was likely smallpox, spread through the empire beginning around 165 AD. Soldiers returning from campaigns in the east carried the disease back to Rome, and it did not discriminate. It struck civilians and soldiers, rich and poor, old and young. By some estimates, between 5 and 10 million people died, wiping out a significant portion of the empire's population. The plague weakened the military, disrupted trade, and filled the streets of Rome with fear. For Marcus, this was not an abstract crisis. It was the daily reality of leading an empire that was bleeding from the inside. Imagine trying to govern while cities emptied. Soldiers died faster from illness than from enemy swords, and the very fabric of society frayed. Marcus had no cure to offer his people. Medicine at the time was primitive, and Rome's greatest physicians were helpless in the face of such a devastating disease. What he could provide instead was steadiness. He did not retreat into luxury, nor did he deny the reality of the plague. He endured it alongside his people, continuing to govern and to campaign on the frontiers while the epidemic raged. In his meditations, we can almost hear the echo of his world falling apart. Reminders to accept mortality, to act with justice while life remained, to focus on what can be controlled when so much cannot. He wrote that every man must be prepared for death, whether it comes at old age or in the next breath, and that to resist this truth is to waste the life we are given. These were not academic words, they were written in the shadow of mass graves. Alongside the plague, Marcus also fought wars on the northern frontiers. The Marcomannic Wars consumed much of his reign. Germanic tribes and other groups pressed against the Danube, testing Rome's strength. These wars were not simple campaigns of conquest, but desperate battles to defend the heartland. Marcus spent years on the frontiers, living in military camps, sharing hardships with his soldiers. This was not common for Roman emperors. Many preferred the comfort of Rome. Marcus, however, understood that leadership meant presence. He led not from a palace, but from a freezing tent, where at night he would take up his pen and write about patience, courage, and the fleeting nature of power. His writings were therapy, a way to strengthen his mind while his body and empire were tested. To connect this to modern life, we can see obvious parallels with leaders during the COVID-19 pandemic. Just as Marcus faced an empire terrified of an unseen enemy, modern leaders face societies shaken by an invisible virus. Hospitals filled, economies stalled, and people looked to their governments for guidance and stability. Some leaders rose to the occasion, showing honesty and calm in the face of uncertainty. Others faltered, denying reality or using the crisis for personal gain. What separates these two types of leadership is not access to cures or technology, but a mindset. Marcus showed that when circumstances are beyond control, a leader's duty is to face them with composure, to model resilience for others. Think about Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, who won global respect for her calm and empathetic communication during the pandemic. Or Angela Merkel in Germany, who explained the science with clarity and seriousness, acknowledging the challenges while urging collective responsibility. These leaders did not promise certainty. They offered steadiness, honesty, and a sense that even in fear, we could act with dignity. That is Stoicism in practice. On the other hand, leaders who denied the seriousness of the virus or sought to shift blame sowed confusion and distrust. proving Marcus's point that the greatest danger in crisis is not the event itself, but our response to it. Marcus's example also resonates with individuals who endured crisis without political power. Consider Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived Nazi concentration camps during World War II. In his famous book Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl wrote that while everything can be taken from a man, one thing cannot: the freedom to choose his attitude in any given set of circumstances. This echoes Marcus almost word for word. Frankl observed that those who survived the camps with their humanity intact were not necessarily the strongest physically, but those who found meaning in their suffering and chose not to surrender their inner freedom. His story proves that Stoicism is not only for emperors, but for anyone facing suffering. Nelson Mandela provides another modern example. Imprisoned for 27 years under South Africa's apartheid regime, he endured conditions designed to break his spirit. Yet Mandela refused to let hatred define him. Like Marcus, he understood that bitterness and vengeance are chains heavier than any prison. When he was finally released, he led not with anger, but with reconciliation, guiding his country toward unity rather than civil war. This capacity to endure injustice while maintaining inner dignity is pure Stoicism. Mandela himself often reflected on the importance of controlling his response when he could not control his circumstances. His leadership was not born of privilege, but of suffering transformed into wisdom. Even in the founding of the United States, Marcus's influence can be traced. Thomas Jefferson owned a copy of Meditations and found inspiration in its pages. Jefferson's idea of natural rights, of the dignity of the individual, of the importance of self-discipline and leadership all resonate with Stoic ideas. While Jefferson was a man of contradictions, he nevertheless drew on Marcus's insistence that personal character is the foundation of public life. The Stoic belief in universal reason and justice influenced Enlightenment thinkers, shaping the democratic ideals that continue to guide nations today. It is worth noting that what all these figures, Marcus, Frankl, Mandela, Jefferson, share is not freedom from suffering, but the ability to use suffering as a teacher. Marcus faced plague and war. Frankl faced the camps. Mandela faced prison. Jefferson faced the challenge of building a new nation from fragile beginnings. In each case, Stoic principles offered a compass. Focus on what is within control: your attitude, your integrity, your daily choices. Accept what lies beyond without bitterness. Do your duty regardless of recognition. This is why Stoicism has endured for centuries, because its truth does not depend on circumstances, but on the unchanging fact of human limitation. In our own time, the relevance is clear. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed how fragile our systems are, how quickly life can be disrupted. People lost jobs, loved ones, and a sense of certainty about the future. For many, this created anxiety, anger, and despair. But others found strength in accepting what could not be changed and focusing on what could. Doctors and nurses who risked their lives each day in hospitals, teachers who adapted to online classrooms, workers who kept food supply chains running. These people lived Stoicism without naming it. They did not control the virus, but they controlled their actions in response. They accepted hardship and fulfilled their roles with dignity. Marcus Aurelius's words remind us that this is the essence of resilience. When he wrote, "You may leave this life at any moment. Let that determine what you do, say, and think." He was not giving a slogan, but stating a reality he lived with every day. His acceptance of death did not make him fatalistic. It made him urgent about living well. In the same way, when we accept that the world will always bring uncertainty, we can focus more clearly on what matters: kindness, integrity, duty, and courage. The lasting power of Marcus's example is that he did not have the luxury of philosophical detachment. He lived in the chaos of leadership, in the middle of wars and plagues, and still practiced philosophy as a lifeline. That is why modern leaders and ordinary people alike continue to turn to his words. Stoicism is not about ignoring pain, but about carrying it with strength. It is not about avoiding responsibility, but about shouldering it with dignity. It is not about controlling the world, but about controlling oneself in the face of the world's storms. Marcus Aurelius endured some of the darkest years of the Roman Empire, signed decrees that shape nations, and still wrestle with the same doubts, fears, and insecurities as any ordinary person. Marcus Aurelius held the most powerful position in the ancient world, and yet he did not spend his nights celebrating his victories or counting his riches. He spent them reminding himself to stay humble, to remain patient with difficult people, to accept death, and to do good while life lasted. If absolute authority could not shield him from suffering or give him lasting peace, then it is obvious that happiness does not come from external power. It comes from within, from the mindset we cultivate and the choices we make each day. This is a lesson that is just as necessary for us today as it was for Marcus in the 2nd century. Modern culture tells us that happiness lies in more wealth, more recognition, more influence, more control. We chase promotions, followers, possessions, and validation, believing that once we reach some imagined summit, we will finally feel secure. But Marcus is the counterexample. He reached the summit. There was no higher office, no greater authority, no more expansive empire to rule. And still, he wrote to himself words like, "Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking." His experience proves that external circumstances, no matter how grand, cannot guarantee peace. They can only test whether we have it inside us already. The real source of serenity, then, is not power but purpose. Marcus's writings insist again and again that the only life worth living is one lived for virtue, for duty, for the common good. He measured himself not by how many enemies he defeated or how much territory he controlled, but by whether he remained just, patient, and faithful to his responsibilities. That is why his philosophy continues to resonate. We all know, deep down, that chasing wealth or status leaves us hungry for more. But living with integrity, choosing to act with kindness, fulfilling our responsibilities with dignity, that is where real satisfaction comes from. A nurse finishing a shift in a crowded hospital, a teacher preparing lessons for her students, a parent caring for children after a long workday. These roles may not come with crowns or applause, but they carry the same possibility for meaning that Marcus found in his imperial duty. And this leads to perhaps the most human lesson Marcus gives us. You do not need to be emperor to live with purpose. Every morning, each of us can wake and ask the same question Marcus asked himself. What can I do today to be a good person? How can I respond to the challenges ahead with patience, justice, and courage? That simple habit of reflection is what transformed Marcus from just another ruler into a philosopher king. And it is a habit available to every one of us. You don't need wealth or fame or armies. You need the willingness to control your mind, to discipline your actions, to accept what you cannot change, and to do good where you can. Think of how powerful this shift can be in everyday life. Instead of waking up dreading the days, difficulties, traffic, arguments, deadlines, you can wake up ready to practice virtue. A difficult coworker becomes a chance to practice patience. A stressful project becomes a chance to practice perseverance. A disappointing outcome becomes a chance to practice acceptance. This is Stoicism not as theory, but as daily exercise, turning each obstacle into training. Marcus often reminded himself that the impediment to action becomes action. The obstacle is the way. Every frustration is a chance to grow in character. If an emperor could think this way while ruling a world in chaos, then surely we can apply it to the chaos of modern life. What makes this lesson urgent is how often we confuse comfort with happiness. Marcus knew that comfort fades, that pleasure is fleeting, that applause disappears. What endures is the peace of knowing you acted well, regardless of outcome. That is why he wrote to himself, "It is not death that a man should fear, but he should fear never beginning to live." Living, for Marcus, meant more than breathing or surviving. It meant choosing to live with purpose, to serve others, to resist corruption, to cultivate inner freedom. This is what gives life weight and meaning. In modern times, we can see countless examples of people who discovered the same truth. Celebrities who seem to have everything: wealth, fame, beauty, often speak openly about their unhappiness, their depression, their sense of emptiness. On the other hand, ordinary people in the midst of hardship often describe finding joy in simple acts of love, in community, in fulfilling duties. A janitor proud of his work, a grandmother raising her grandchildren, a volunteer giving time to help others. These lives, though unnoticed by the world, are filled with the kind of dignity Marcus believed mattered most. Power does not guarantee happiness. Purpose does. This is why Marcus Aurelius remains so relevant today. His life and words remind us to look inward rather than outward, to measure our lives not by external achievements, but by internal integrity. If we chase after wealth and recognition, we may achieve them and still feel empty. But if we cultivate a calm mind, a steady heart, and a dedication to doing good, we will find peace regardless of what happens outside. That is the true meaning of freedom, and it is available to everyone, emperor or not. So the real question is not what crown you wear, what office you hold, or what titles you achieve. The real question is, how do you live today? What attitude will you choose in the face of frustration? What action will you take in service of others? What virtue will you practice when the world tests you? Marcus Aurelius faced these questions at the height of power, but they're the same questions we face in our daily lives. His answer, again and again, was simple. Focus on what is within your control, accept what is beyond it, and do good while you can. Every morning you wake, you do not need to be emperor to ask yourself the same question Marcus asked. Today, how can I live more virtuously? How can I practice patience, justice, courage, and self-control? This question is more important than any job title, more valuable than any amount of money, more enduring than any recognition. It is the question that defines a meaningful life. And in asking it, you join a tradition that stretches back thousands of years, linking you to the philosopher king who sat in a tent at the edge of the Roman Empire, reminding himself of the same truth. As you reflect on these lessons, I invite you to carry them forward. Let them shape the way you respond to stress at work, to conflict in relationships, to disappointment in life. Remember that power and success will not shield you from suffering, but your mindset can carry you through it. Remember that happiness does not come from control over others, but from control over yourself. Remember that every obstacle is an opportunity to grow, every frustration a chance to practice virtue, every morning a fresh chance to ask the only question that matters: what can I do today to be a better human being? And if these ideas have resonated with you, if you have found something valuable here that you can apply to your own life, I would like to ask for your support. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who might also benefit from the wisdom of Marcus Aurelius. If you would like to go further and support the work that goes into creating content like this, consider clicking the Super Thanks button below. Every contribution helps keep this channel alive and makes it possible to continue exploring timeless philosophy in a way that is practical for modern life. Marcus Aurelius lived as emperor, but he reminds us that greatness does not require a throne. It requires only the courage to face life with honesty, to accept what we cannot change, to act with justice, and to seek meaning not in power, but in purpose. That is the lesson he leaves us. That is the lesson we can live starting today, right where we are.